Arkansas are in a tight one, 21-23. We're going to talk about the craziness that happened at Neyland Stadium today and obviously all the other action of the day so far. Josh, Wisconsin getting their teeth kicked in by Ohio State, which we kind of called that one in our preview, so we're not too super surprised there. But let's talk a little bit about Arkansas and A&M. Arkansas is very much feeling like last year for the most of this game, where Arkansas jumped out early, a couple of big plays, but then have kind of sputtered. They did just put one on and to make it 21-23. Talk a little bit about what you've seen. Have you been surprised? Just a reminder for everybody in our previews, I picked Arkansas to win. You picked A&M to win. We both said we wouldn't be shocked regardless of the outcome. Talk about what you've seen so far.
Honestly, this game has looked a lot like what I personally expected, which is that Texas A&M has by no means looked fluent or fluid in their offense or what they managed to accomplish. But what they have been able to do is get guys isolated in space in Arkansas, and they've made some really big splash plays. I mean, Arkansas has moved the ball, I think, a lot more consistently than Texas A&M, but you can definitely sort of tell that when it comes to the 3 or 4 splash players for each team, I think Texas A&M has some advantages over Arkansas. And when they get those isolations, things tend to happen in their favor. I'm not really sure that Texas A&M is going to be able to pull it out. Obviously, if it hadn't been for that big scoop and score fumble, the handoff, A&M would be behind right now. But I do think, in my mind, this actually isn't a shocking result. I don't think it is in yours either. I already felt like these two teams are a lot more even than people wanted to give them credit for, somewhat due to schedule, somewhat due to circumstance. And honestly, yeah, there's just not a ton here that really surprises me, believe it or not.
Sorry, guys, I was on mute. I think my big takeaway here is it's not been pretty football for the most part, but I do think A&M's found a little bit more on offense than maybe we've seen so far. And we talked about that a little bit in our preview, that Max Johnson seemed to give A&M a little more. Maybe not great, maybe it was a little uneven, but a little more. And I think we've seen that a lot tonight. I will say, though, I think we had them in the 20 to 24 point range. Without that weird return touchdown, they're right in that area, assuming they put a few more points on the board. So, yeah, nothing at all has surprised me in this one. If you'll see me looking past the cameras, because I got these games going on in the background. Josh, real quick on Florida, Tennessee. I want to do kind of a review of that later, but let's talk about the dumbest offensive or just scheme and call I've seen this year. Set the stage for everybody, where Florida scored late. They were down 17, and all of the dumb decisions that might have cost them the game that were really unnecessary.
So I'll try to track it. I know you were following this game a little closer than I was, and I'm aware. So the part that I followed, and this is the problem, because I was, as you guys would guess, we're usually following about 5 games at a time. I caught the part where they went for 2 and they didn't need to, which put them in the situation where at the end of the game, they had to score to win, score a touchdown to win, whereas they should have been in a position to be able to kick a field goal to tie, if I followed it right.
Yeah. So what it was, they had like 4th and 2 on the 7 or something like that, and they were down 17. Well, you need 3 points. 3 scores, regardless of what you do. Even if you hit 2-point conversions twice, you still are down 1 point. So you need 3 points. The easiest path to victory or to tie, because you're playing to at least get to tie at that point, the easiest path is 2 scores and a field goal. Well, 4th down, you need 3 points. So going for it on 4th down, they got lucky and scored the touchdown, but that was a dumb decision, because that's a high risk, reward situation. You need a field goal in any scenario at that point. So that's one decision. They score the touchdown, and then they go for 2 to make it where they're down by 9 instead of 10 for some unknown reason. Well, they miss it, and then they score again, and they missed the 2-point conversion again. So now they're down 4. I think it was 4 at the end of the game. They got the onside kick, and they got down to like the 38-yard line. And instead of being able to throw a couple more passes to get in really good field goal range, they had to go for a touchdown because they had missed these two-point conversions that were unnecessary if they didn't go for it in the first place. So I thought it was ridiculous. I think that this whole thing of chasing points is insane. We saw it in the Maryland game too, where they were going for 2 to make it a 3-point game instead of a 4-point game with 9.5 minutes left. It's really insane. And these are basics. And Billy Napier is somebody that he doesn't bring some crazy scheme to the table. So he needs to be a really good coach first in these decisions. And I thought it was pretty insane. Josh, like I said, we'll get into that game a little bit later. I just want to talk about how crazy that was. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in this Wisconsin-Ohio State mud hole stomping?
Yeah, and that's another one that I need to get all the scores in front of me, but that's another one I feel like we had pegged pretty well. Several times in recent years, Ohio State has blown out Wisconsin. And what I consistently feel like is the case, Wisconsin is a very sound team. Defensively, they're a sound team offensively, but not a particularly good or explosive one. And teams like Ohio State stress you in ways that most teams don't. And what I mean by that is really twofold. First, offensively, Ohio State can do a lot of things where they're very multiple, and they can get you in isolations on linebackers and stuff like that. And I think sometimes those downhill, like sure tackling Wisconsin defenders that usually look really good end up getting really exposed against Ohio State, because now Ohio State can spread them out and they can put 5 wide receivers on the field and they can throw to any of those 5 wide receivers. And so all of a sudden they start giving up points. And then the second way that you get exposed is when Wisconsin gets in a hole, they are not built to get out of it. Like their whole offense is built on ground and pound. It's sort of their identity for years now. And when they have to get in a football game where they've got to score and they're down like 21-3, and they know the other team is going to score some more points in the rest of the game, you have to move to a more pass first offense. And when they do that, they become bad. I mean, Graham Mertz is not a good quarterback running that kind of offense. He's only good at managing the basics of the game and throwing when he has to, or throwing, sort of as a change up. So that's kind of my view on it. I think it all really compounds. And again, I had this game billed as a blowout, and I'm not really surprised that it is.
Yeah. And look, I did the little stat resume card for that game. And I noted that Wisconsin in yards per attempt was number 2 passing offense in the country. And we said on that preview that, look, Graham Mertz, he had like 16 yards per attempt against 2 Cupcakes, and then 7 yards per attempt against Washington State, which we saw today. Bo Nix went ham, like 420 or something. So we flagged in that discussion that you're not going to beat Ohio State with exactly what you said, that kind of ground and pound, tough-nosed football team where you win 17-14, although they lost 17-14 to Washington State. You need somebody that can, against a Washington State's throwing for 12, 13 yards per attempt, because it's going to get lower against Ohio State. Now we're seeing at one point in the game, he was throwing for less than 4 yards per attempt. And I don't want to get too heavy into stats or whatever, but like, you need somebody that can stretch the field, that's dynamic, because Ohio State's going to get theirs. And the problem we've seen with these teams, and Wisconsin's not very good this year, by the way, not taking anything away from what Ohio State's doing tonight because they've been dominant. But we've seen this with teams in the Big Ten lately. They don't have the quarterbacks to go step for step with an Ohio State who does have a quarterback. I've heard some rumors that JSN might be out for a little bit longer. He's not playing tonight, but it hasn't mattered. Interestingly, they've been doing it with the running game. So, Josh, why don't you talk about what's going on right now with Oklahoma? I mean, that's a tighter game, I think, than we expected, because Kansas State hasn't looked great this year. Are you a little surprised that they gave up 24 in 2 quarters?
This is a tough one because I've kind of had it on in the side, but I haven't followed it as closely as I have some other games. I'm not shocked, because I don't think you can just fix all the defensive woes that Oklahoma had. I mean, there's a lot of problems that Lincoln Riley left in terms of personnel. Those are not going to be fixed overnight. And development doesn't just change on a dime. And I think we saw that with Texas today, right? That Texas, everybody was saying, oh, they brought in Gary Patterson. He's in the background. Their defense is fixed. Everything's fine and wonderful. Nothing to see here. Don't look behind the curtain. Maybe you should have looked behind the curtain a little bit, because suddenly those defenses that had problems last year start to have problems again. And I think it especially crops up when playing in something that's not a marquee game, because guys aren't as focused, and some of those old habits and tendencies in terms of practice habits, in terms of how they play, maybe a lack of focus and intensity start to creep up. So I'm not shocked in that regard. I think the bigger thing, and I don't know that it's that shocking in this particular game, is that the offense for Oklahoma isn't really picking up. And I think a lot of people feel like, and I'm probably in this camp, that Venables is going to make, in general, a pretty good improvement for Oklahoma as a football team. But I think we forget in the immediate aftermath of that transition that you lose someone that is, I think, actually an offensive genius in Lincoln Riley. And I think he has a lot of faults as a head coach.
And a lot of the players.
And a lot of players too. That's true. I mean, there were a lot of pieces that are gone from that team offensively. And so my biggest thing is, I'm not shocked that they gave up 24, but usually in these games they can kind of keep pace and they just kind of stay on top of you. And that's, I think, where the bigger concerns or challenges are now as we're getting into the middle of the third quarter.
All right, so we got a super chat from Benjamin V, who says Michigan has issues, but if JJ hits one more deep ball and Stokes doesn't fumble, it's a blowout. Maryland is probably better than we thought. It's early. So there's a couple of things here. One, I pointed out on Twitter, neither one of these teams had played a Power 5 team yet, and they had played the teams they had played were combined 2-14 against FBS, not P5, but just FBS in general competition, and had 2 FCS losses. So these are the bottom of the barrel, like worst 6 teams in the country that these two teams have played. That's not to say that you can't be good having played bad teams. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we don't know anything about these teams. So we still don't know anything about these teams because they haven't played anybody. A lot of people assume that this was kind of a bad, ugly win for Michigan, but that's based on the assumption of who Maryland has been and not necessarily who they are. For the record, I agree with Benjamin here. Maryland is probably a decent team. From what I saw today, Demas and Jarrett are great wide receivers. Talia looked good today to me. Offensive line held up pretty well, which might be a concern for Michigan. I was not impressed with JJ at all. There were guys like, yes, if he hits one more deep ball, but there were 25 deep balls to be had that he missed. I was not impressed with him, and I think if he played a better defense today, Michigan loses that game. Corm looked great. Run game looked great. For me, Josh, it's tough for me to put right now, and just kind of a spoiler alert for my top 10, I'm moving Bama back up to third, and we'll talk about them in a minute. I've got Georgia, Ohio State, Bama. Michigan's that 4th team probably, but I think there's a drop-off to Michigan, at least based on what I saw today. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I'm not as sold as you are that Maryland is a quality opponent. I really felt like more than anything, Michigan left a lot on the field. And I agree with you. I mean, McCarthy did not play well. JJ did not play well. They had a lot of opportunities over the top. They missed those consistently. And because that, it allowed Maryland to play them a certain way defensively. I do think Maryland has some real, genuine offensive pop. But the thing that was jarring to me personally was the way that Maryland stoned that Michigan pass rush on many occasions. I mean, there were times where Talia Tagovailoa just had forever to throw the ball. And we talked about up to this point, it looked like Michigan had kind of reloaded on the defensive line and they hadn't missed as much of a beat as people thought. And that's kind of what our expectation probably was. I'm just concerned by midway through this game, and I'm really maintain that concern now. That has been kind of Maryland's Achilles heel. Their offense, because it is so heavily RPO based, it's tough on the offensive line. They're not blocking downhill almost ever, and they tend to get beat some. And that didn't happen. So I actually have a lot more concerns with Michigan coming out of it. Now, the offense, I think, was just kind of sputtering, and I think normally they score more, but my concerns more than anything were on the defensive side of the ball. They did not get consistent push and disruptions. They got some, especially later in the game, but they didn't get it consistently, and there were way too many instances where Maryland just had forever to throw the football.
Josh, I'm going to turn a quick one around to you. Dave Valinsky says that PJ Fleck is for real. The Gophers are for real. Went to Michigan State and embarrassed the Spartans. When is this team going to be recognized for how good they are in the national media? I think I think that Michigan State is not great. I think Minnesota beating them 34-7 is noteworthy, especially since they could probably have beaten them 50-7. That game was so unbalanced. It's insane. So, Josh, talk about that a little bit in terms of like, I know you've had some criticisms of PJ Fleck in the past. Kind of hop on that super chat. Thank you, Dave.
It's going to be a long time before I'm a real believer in PJ Fleck, frankly. I think he has the ability to get his team up for a game. I think they are pretty innovative and aggressive in their approach. But I also think there's a lot of reasons to believe that Michigan State may be a pretty flawed football team this year. They were pretty heavily reliant on transfers last season. That's the reason they became better as fast as they did. Let's not forget the fact that Michigan State lost by double digits to Washington, and I'm not sure that was a great Washington team. They struggled a little bit in their opener, and I think didn't they open with Kent State? Am I crazy? No, it was Western Michigan. Kent State was Oklahoma. But they haven't looked great a couple times this year. Now, I think the performance they had against Michigan State was very noteworthy. They are a good team. I think when they play up to their opponent, they play extremely well. And I think Morgan is a very good quarterback, which is the biggest thing. But maybe that last point is kind of the key. Morgan is a very good quarterback. And what did we see from Michigan State last year? Their deep pass defense last season was atrocious. Terrible pass defense. And it got hidden a lot because they played a lot of teams that did not have good quarterback play. And I think Minnesota is a very good team. I think they deserve to be ranked, certainly. But I also understand why that game turned out the way it did. And this is sort of my question to people when they say things like, when are they going to get the recognition they deserve? What recognition are you talking about, right? Are you talking about just being ranked? Because then I totally agree with you. Are you saying Minnesota's a top 10 team? Because I'm not ready to agree with that argument, if that's the one you're making. So everything in this sport is all relative, right? And so that's kind of where I sit between the two. I think the defensive performance from Minnesota was the most impressive part of it. But again, this is a Michigan State team that has a lot of new pieces and a lot of key pieces on the offensive side of the ball last year that are no longer there. So it's kind of hard for me still to evaluate them properly, other than saying that was a good dominant win.
I will say, it's tough because are they top 10? I don't know, but are they top 10 based on the fact that nobody wants to be in the top 10 this year and everybody wants to lose to G5 teams and suck? From that standpoint, like, I think Minnie's a top 15 team based on what I've seen so far this year. I do. I think that they'll probably lose some games they shouldn't. I'm not as high on Tanner Morgan as a lot of people, but I do like Ibrahim's a great running back. I think they've got some pieces, but again, yeah, you're right. Michigan State, woof. Stephen Light, who brings it every single weekend, has a note to you, Josh, and it's tough because the people in podcast won't get to see your glorious face on camera background. You got your nerd shelves going. You got a College Football Nerds vinyl going. Glad the nerds are back for another night. Here's a donation to help fund the cost of new wall decorations in Josh's bunker. Josh is a long time coming, and let me tell you, these run a lot smoother when there's two of us talking and there's not me manning the chat trying to think of stuff to say. Not having time to gather my thoughts and having to do this solo. So I'm sure everybody listening is also thankful that you're back.
Well, it would go the other way too. There's probably going to be some point where I have to solo it, and there's a lot going on when you're doing this and you're doing it live. Hopefully people appreciate that it is not the easiest thing to be able to do this live, and we kind of have to go back and forth a little bit because you've got to be able, like, I kind of know how these games go, but I want to be able to pull up a box score to talk about it, and that I got to lead in when he asks a question, and it goes the other way around. So when you're doing it all yourself, I can't have a window open to look at the chat and to look at the box score and to look at the games that are going on live and to look at my list of super chats all at the same time. I don't really know how, Daniel, you did that by yourself last week, though I think the answer is you did the best you could. So I'm glad to be back.
Lots of uhs and ums. That's how I do it. And lots of talking about how hard it was. Arkansas just hit an upright. They are kind of pulling a Missouri late. They fumbled a snap. that moved the kick back, and then they dunked it off the upright. A&M's defense is what's going to win them this game. I mean, yes, they've scored 23 points, but again, A&M, so this is again 16, 17 points of offensive production. That's what we said on the previews. Like, that's what they're going to score, whether they're playing App State's terrible defense or they're playing, Arkansas, who may not have a great defense. A&M is a 17 offensive point offense until proven otherwise. And yes, they're going to win this game. I think it's much to do with credit to their defense. But Josh, at what point is that who they are? And then how much concern should they have getting into the meat of their schedule?
Well, I think both teams in this game should have concerns getting into the meat of their schedule a little bit. I think it's kind of funny because I think Arkansas is a good offense that's being limited by a very good Texas A&M defense, and I think Texas A&M is still a bad offense that is being made to look a lot better than they are by how bad Arkansas's defense is. To give away a little bit where my thought process is, I have said publicly on Twitter and a couple other places a few times now, I feel like Arkansas in the top 10 is too highly rated. They beat Cincinnati, who is a good team. They beat South Carolina, who's a very bad team, who they're struggling, I think, right now with Charlotte. May well lose that game. Last I looked, I haven't seen the score in a hot minute. I think Arkansas is a team that should be ranked. I don't think they should be top 10. I think Texas A&M is probably a team that is a borderline top 25 team because they're so limited on offense. And so our viewpoint of that game is a little bit skewed, but the SEC is going to be a meat grinder. I think the SEC is down this year in a lot of ways. That second tier isn't there, and that's reflected nationally with kind of where everybody's at from a metrics ranking standpoint. But I also think the SEC is sneakily deep in that third tier goes a long way. And there are a lot of games, LSU, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, that a team like Arkansas or Texas A&M can lose. And so I think, I think the odds of somebody coming out of these schedules with really clean win-loss records is going to be pretty low. And when you throw Alabama into the mix, you're going to see a lot of 4-loss. I mean, you may see the second best team in the SEC West come out with 4 losses. I'm not sure how good they will or won't be. And in fact, I'm not sure they will be that great this year. But the records are going to kind of reflect it. I will be surprised, honestly, if you see a 10-win team finish second in the SEC West. I think there's going to be just a huge sort of puddle in the middle. I don't know if you agree with me on that.
Yeah, I said somebody argued with me today that the SEC was still the best conference in the country. I said, I think it's the Big Ten this year. I mean, who's the second best team in the West? It's either Arkansas, who's currently losing, so maybe it's A&M. So it's either A&M, who lost to App State, or it's a team that's already lost to Florida State. Like, those are the only two options, because we saw how bad Auburn is today. Auburn's terrible. Auburn should have lost to Missouri, and they may not win another game. They might lose to Western Kentucky before that Alabama game. Darius Williams said, "What if I told you 10 years ago Alabama is going to run a high-tempo air raid?" Although anybody who watched Alabama play Texas would argue that it is a low-tempo air raid, Josh. But, 10 years ago, Alabama, that was Nussmeier, right? Like, that was a pretty boring kind of pro-style West Coast sort of thing. Wasn't that Nussmeier 10 years ago?
Yeah. So it was Nussmeier. It was 10 years ago. He was there and he ended up at Florida. There are a couple of guys I tracked, and I'm drawing a blank on the other guy that ended up at Auburn when they had the disaster in 2012. There were 2 coordinators that kind of traded around coaches that were struggling. Nussmeier's one
that ended
Steele?
Up with, was that Kevin Steele? Because he went to Auburn from Alabama, right?
No. Offensive coordinator.
Oh.
Offensive coordinator. Somebody could look it up in 2012. But they converted to a pro style coming out of Malzahn with him, and they struggled. But Alabama under Nussmeier, I've actually always believed, really underachieved in those years. And that's when they were still kind of coming out of anaconda mode. They were really talented offensively, like really talented. That 2013 Alabama team had a freshman Derrick Henry. They had, I want to say it was TJ
Yeldon. Yep.
They had Amari Cooper. They had a really good offensive line. Their receiving core was a bit hit or miss. otherwise, but they still had some pretty good guys on it. But that was a really talented team. And when you go back a year to like 2012, when they did win the national title, but like they dropped the Texas A&M game and they had some other games where they sputtered. There was no excuse for it because that team had was Eddie Lacy backed up by TJ Yeldon. That's when Eddie Lacy was kind of at the peak of his career. And again, they still had Amari Cooper. They had an absolutely loaded defense. They had A.J. McCarron, who wasn't the greatest quarterback ever, the way some Alabama fans seem to want to make him. But he is an long-term NFL backup, which means he's a really darn good quarterback. Those were really talented teams, and I think statistically they've always looked good, but scoring-wise, they weren't. There's, especially in big games, they were really predictable, and they did a lot of crossing routes and simple stuff, and they couldn't really adjust, and they couldn't break out of a box. And I think personally, I've always believed that Lane Kiffin's hype has as much to do with where Nussmeier had sort of retarded Alabama's offense for years as it does what Lane Kiffin did. Basically, Alabama had been held back quite a bit from where they should have been given the talent level they had offensively. And when people saw, and I've always said this, when you see coaching changes, a lot of times those big shifts where people get really hyped have as much to do with the outgoing coach as they do the incoming one. So sort of a long aside there, but that's the way, as Saban said, right? Is this what you want? Is this what you want football to be when they made those changes in terms of linemen downfield that allowed for the RPO? And when he was saying that, I think you should have immediately realized that Alabama was going to go that route the moment they allowed those rule changes to stay in effect.
Yep, and he's won 3 titles since then and played for a couple more. Javari Williams coming in with a huge $20 super chat. Thank you so much, Javari. He's wanting to talk about Michigan, so we will accommodate. Last year,
I think 2 of those, two $20 super chats, if I followed correctly.
Awesome. I'm a little behind y'all on the super chat, so I'll catch up. But last year, our run game was dominant enough that we could lean on it no matter what. We don't have the point of having JJ start is to give us downfield passing game. We saw JJ needs more experience. I think that JJ McCarthy is also a pretty he can be a mobile quarterback in some ways, kind of like Stetson Bennett is, in that he's shifty enough to give you more time in the pocket. I don't love the way that they've got him operating in this offense because it feels a little more like pro style-y. They need to have him getting the ball out. And I didn't love what I saw from how they set him up today. But I do think in that second half, he got a lot more comfortable. And this is the first game against like a conference opponent. It's not a scrub. It's a real start. And there probably was some early jitters. But I agree with Javari here that Michigan's going to have to find something at quarterback if they want to win a playoff game, because they can't just lean on Corum. Once you get up into the upper echelon of athletic defenses and teams that are in playoff level, the run game usually is just a complement to having a vertical passing attack, Josh.
Yeah. Michigan has some pieces that are really good that give them some ability to make explosive plays. And we talked a lot in our preview. We did a season preview on Michigan where I thought they were a top 5 team. And I noted in that one that I thought they were where Notre Dame should have been, or they were what Notre Dame was being hyped to be. And I don't think I was wrong, but the passing game today was a lot more inconsistent than I expected. And, Corum is one of the more explosive players in the country. And I think he gives them pop in ways you wouldn't expect, like the 4th down play, right? They can score touchdowns or have big yardage plays out of sets and out of particular play types that you don't normally see that. But what they're really not good at is organically generating big plays. And it's because of limitations in the passing game. So unless they operate a good run game and work off that with easy throws, they just kind of struggle. I am pretty concerned for them given what I just saw out of McCarthy, because I thought he was going to end up seizing the offense as the guy, and he was not great. We talked about that earlier. The only thing I'll say is I've seen him hit those throws before in a number of different games. I thought he looked better against Georgia in the national semifinal last year than he looked today. So some of this I'll just chalk up to having a bad day, but Michigan is not going to be a great football team or not a top 5 football team with the kind of passing game they had today. They need to be a lot better than that to sort of be able to pass to set up the run in certain occasions or deal with stack boxes and that kind of stuff if they want to take the next step.
And Javar did have a second super chat talking about the O-line not holding up and the play calling issues. And look, I think that, and I touched on that earlier, I didn't think that they set him up enough for success with some of the play calling, but I also feel like some of it's probably jitters. Some of it is he's going to settle down. If he has the confidence to know that the deep ball is there, those open shots are there, then he just has to get some timing down. And I will say, there were times where his receivers didn't help him out today. And I did not come away super impressed with the wide receiver group at Michigan, the way I felt like Alabama's looked for a lot of the time this year. And I don't know that it's a problem with the receivers as much as it is getting them meshing with the quarterback in terms of timing and understanding and knowing where people are going to be sitting in zones and knowing what little reads are there and just how fast you're running downfield and things like that. So I do think it'll probably come. But it's better to work these things out after a win, right, than it is after a loss. Josh, somebody asked, I saw it kind of go through the chat. They were happy to see you back and wanted to know what was your favorite part of your vacation. Give me 30 seconds on that.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a Halloween nut. So I went to, as I've been doing every year for a while, Halloween Horror Nights at Universal. And my favorite part there, it's always the haunted houses or mazes, but they have one called Dead Man's Pier. You can find a YouTube of it. Really, really impressive. Like they build them in those giant warehouses that they use in the spring for recording. And they had like a lighthouse and like an entire ship they built. So it's not just like a normal haunted house in a room, but it was basically like being outside somewhere in Nova Scotia. Pretty crazy. Like snow machines inside it, where it's actually snowing inside the building in Florida in September. Pretty wild. So yeah, it's a fun time.
Braden Insanes with the $5 super chat. Thank you so much. As bad as Auburn has looked, I still think we have a shot at beating LSU next week. I mean, I think that anything can happen from that standpoint. I'm not going to say that it's not going to happen, but Auburn is a bad, like Braden, I love you. I thank you for the super chat, and I hate to do this to you, but Auburn's a bad football team. And I think that it in a lot of ways, losing today might have been better for them because they could have that clear cut, because Harsin would not have made it back to the locker room, I don't think. I just, from what I saw today, like Missouri is objectively worse in my mind than Vanderbilt, and should have, like, just, they begged Auburn to please take the game from us. We don't want to win it. LSU is on, even with their struggles on offense and, not looking great against Florida State, they're in a completely other universe. Like, they're probably 30 points better than Missouri, right?
I don't know about 30 points necessarily, because they do have their own issues, but they are a lot better than Missouri. I don't know that I would say Missouri is objectively worse than Vanderbilt. I think there's a real chance that Missouri will lose to Vanderbilt, and that says a lot because Vanderbilt's not particularly good. Now, granted, Vanderbilt has looked better this year, so it's hard to say. But yeah, they're really bad. Like Missouri is probably a bottom third in the country. Bad, probably one of the. I mean, would you agree with me? Probably one of the worst 5 to 10 P5 teams. Easily one of the 10 worst P5 teams. P5, maybe one of the 5.
Yeah. I mean, Boston College is pretty terrible. There's probably some pretty real bad Pac-12 teams. But you can't say Kansas. You can't say Duke. They're a combined 7-1 now. So yeah, they're bad. And it wasn't like Auburn made some, like, had some bad luck or whatever. They got outplayed by Missouri, and they do, like, if you can't score on that defense, they got blown out by Kansas State. If you can't score on that defense, you're not scoring on LSU. And that's the thing to me, is like, they look like they are going out there and getting in a huddle and saying, hey, you go long, you run an in, you run a hitch, and I'll try to find you. Like, that's what their offense looks like to me. And I think a lot of it is because they have problems at quarterback. But in general, I just don't see where they're going to find more than like 13 points And that's a problem because Auburn, while they're not super talented, I think they're playing beneath their talent level right now, which to me speaks to coaching. And so I don't know where you go from here, but Josh, anything today that tells you anything but Harson's getting fired?
Not really. Defensively, they actually look pretty good at times. They've got a good pass rush from Hall. He was all over the place. They've got some good players in the back end, but the problem is their defense has lost some pieces sort of slowly over the past couple years, and they haven't quite been able to replace them. And this year, I think you're starting to see certain positions, particularly when you get into depth, where they're a little bit deficient and you can find some edges. But offensively, man, I mean, you look at the box score here. Ashford went
Do I have
127.
to?
Yeah, Ashford went 127 yards on 18 attempts. Gariner, the freshman that had to play when Ashford got hurt, managed 8 yards passing with a QBR of 0.5. And I'll say Ashford's, by the way, was 31. Rushing, Ashford led the team in rushing with 46 yards on 15 carries. Tank Bigsby is by far their best player. He was 19 carries of 44 yards, which is a little over 2 yards a carry. So it's not good.
And this is a bad defense they played too.
Yeah. And the problem is that it all kind of stacks. The wide receiver unit might be the worst in the conference. In fact, at this point, knowing how good Shepard is for Vanderbilt, knowing that Missouri does have a couple guys, which you saw in that Auburn game, I think Auburn probably does have the worst receiver unit in the conference. The offensive line has been a disappointment at Auburn this year. They had Ham that ended up having to sort of medically retire from football, some other issues, but they haven't been as good as expected. Their quarterback situation is a mess, and you stack all that on top, and it's just you've got one NFL caliber running back, and that's it. Like, that's literally it. So yeah, I'm kind of dumping on a super chat, but I don't see any way for this cycle to turn around. Even if they win a couple games, they're not going to be good all year. They're just not. And anybody that can manage 25 plus on them, I just think they're going to struggle to match it almost regardless of opponent.
So Billy Boy coming in with a super chat and helping us with a segue, because we got to talk about Georgia a little bit. Georgia really struggled with Kent State today. I think it was 39-22. Billy Boy says best thing that could have happened to Georgia happened today. And somebody said something similar on Twitter. And I said, and this is the analog, because Kirby Smart came from the Saban tree and Georgia is getting into that kind of Alabama type place where they reload. They don't rebuild. This is Nick Saban's favorite type of game ever. Win by a couple of touchdowns or more against a team that you were probably trying a lot of stuff out on, had some bad luck with turnovers, had some funky plays happen, and then you wake up or look up in the third quarter and you're not blowing them out, and it's Kent State. For me, I'll tell you my thoughts, Josh. I think that I've seen enough from Georgia last year and this year. Like how much do I weigh this game against the reigning national champion beating Oregon by 46 points? Oregon, who won again today. Like, I've seen enough from Georgia to feel pretty good, and I'm still going to have them at number one. Are you concerned with this Kent State game, or is this another one of those, like, they're working on stuff and it's not a big deal?
I have some concerns coming out of this game, but it's not probably for the reasons that people would necessarily expect. When you talk turnover luck and that kind of thing, if it's a consistent problem, if you know you have turnover prone, like interception prone quarterbacks and that kind of stuff, yeah, that starts to play into my thought process for projecting a team long term. And as we always said, there's a divide between projecting a team and trying to interpret where a team should be in your rankings. Those are two separate things. What they've accomplished and how good they are often not the same thing. I do think Oregon is a good team. They looked really bad at times today versus Washington State and came back and win. And I think that's indicative of the fact that Oregon is capable of playing really bad football. And I still maintain that Oregon played really bad football against Georgia. But Georgia in that game, I've often said, like, look, Oregon was horrible, But that doesn't mean that I'm taking it away from Georgia, because Georgia did everything that was in front of them in a dominant fashion, which is why I had Georgia number 1. This game was a little bit weirdly like almost the opposite in that sort of analysis, in that Georgia was in a close game because they kept turning the ball over. I think at one point they were -4 in turnovers, and they went into the half without having punted. Okay. So it wasn't like Kent State was stopping them. When you talk about their offense being herky-jerky or whatnot, they weren't having 3 and outs or anything like that. They just kept fumbling the ball. They kept having dumb turnovers. And that causes you to end up in a game where you can be close with anybody, right? That's the Citadel 10-10 game where they were tied at the half with Alabama. And again, it doesn't always mean a lot. In that same game, I've always noted, Alabama won like 49-10 or something like that, because they again never punted. They just fumbled the ball 3 times in the first half, and you don't get that many possessions when that starts happening. My problem in the Kent State game is not the 39 from Georgia, because they should have put up like 46-53, given the type of offensive production they were getting, given how well they were actually moving the ball. I mean, Stetson Bennett didn't have his best day, but he was still, I think, hovering around 8 yards per attempt. And really across the board, they had over 250 yards rushing. Every back in the game had a good rushing average of over 4 yards a carry. My concerns were the defensive side of the ball. I saw some cracks. Kent State had success on the ground. They ran for over 4 yards a carry with their lead tailback. They had success for the air. Not a ton, but again, like over 7 yards per attempt. Kent State moved the ball earnestly in that game. And the reason it was close, in part, yes, was due to Georgia having some turnover luck and stuff like that. But defensively, this is the first game where I saw where Georgia seemed to be a little more vulnerable, especially on the back end. And you could sort of see the turnover on that defensive roster a little bit more. Whereas before, they just swarmed people to the line of scrimmage to the point where their offenses didn't operate. It didn't happen versus Kent State. So it does make me a little more curious when they play better offensive lines, sort of like we've seen with a lot of Clemson teams, including today. Maybe that's a segue. Sometimes defenses that look really, really good because they have great defensive fronts aren't so great that they will dominate. 2018 Clemson could dominate everyone they played on the defensive front. That's like a generationally rare thing. Other teams usually can be at least held somewhat in check by an offensive line, and suddenly you get stressed in different ways. That's kind of a question I have for Georgia, in the same way that I think Clemson just got exposed a little bit.
So Dave Valinsky says, I don't think Minnesota is a top 10 team yet. Definitely somewhere between 18 and 25. We won't know until they play Penn State. I don't know that we can do top 10 tonight, Josh, because USC is currently losing to Oregon State, and Caleb Williams is 3 for 12 for like 20 yards. But Penn State might be a team that's deserving of top 10 consideration. Talk about that a little bit. We didn't see, I didn't love what I saw from them today, but I do think that Central Michigan is not a terrible team. That's the team that put 44 up on Oklahoma State in the opener. So talk a little bit about Penn State and how you feel in terms of are you ready? I'm going to do to you the thing that we do to everybody else. If you're not ready to put them in the top 10, do you feel good about 10 teams ahead of them?
That's the question right now, I think, across the board. I think if you have any argument where you feel pretty confident that somebody's not one of the top 10 teams, you need to send me all your notes, because you've got a list of 10 teams that are really good that I currently don't have. I do think Penn State has a lot of flaws. I mean, I think they are very much up and down with Sean Clifford's play, and Sean Clifford as a player is up and down. They've got a couple of really good running backs. This time it was Allen that showed up more, whereas Singleton was the one that sort of blew up against Auburn. And I think the defense is quite good, but the defense being quite good is still, they got run on some, they got thrown on a little bit by Central Michigan, and against Central Michigan's 1-3. They're not a great team. I think Penn State is probably in my book ranked appropriately around 15th. I think when you start getting 10th or higher, starts to get a little more rarefied air, and things get a little bit more difficult. So I think both Minnesota and Penn State are going to be a little bit of a question mark for a while this season. And I think the Big Ten in general is actually really hard to evaluate. You made the point that you thought the Big Ten is better than the SEC. I think I could buy that argument. I'm not going to discredit it, but I also think it's kind of hard to prove. I think there's a lot of unknowns in the Big Ten, and things like Penn State being Auburn by a large sum. Auburn's a bad football team.
Yeah, but do we think LSU's like you talk about like the next best team in the SEC? Do we think an LSU is going to beat them 44-12 or whatever that score was on the road? I don't. So that's. I mean, I think they're bad.
But I'm not going to put LSU in my top 10 though.
No, no. I'm talking about like in general. Like right now, it's so hard to do a top 10, and you talk about rarefied air. Like I don't think there's anybody past 4 that's deserving to be in the top 10 at all, especially how USC is playing tonight. So, but from the standpoint of like the third best team in the SEC is probably Tennessee. But then the next team is probably either Florida or LSU. They got to play each other, so there's going to be a loss there. But like, I don't know that anybody outside of Tennessee, Georgia, or Alabama goes on the road at Auburn while they're lathered up and still undefeated and beats them 44-12. That's my point. Maybe not put, and Stephen Light said, don't jinx us, Josh. Don't put us in your top 10. So he's happy. He's happy you don't got him in the top 10. But if I'm sitting here thinking about like Big Ten versus SEC or who do I put in the top 10, that win is more impressive to me now than it was. Just like Georgia's win is impressive against Oregon, which segues me back to Edward Chun, Edward always gets at us. He's got this like brotherly, loving temper with us, and I love it. He said, Notre Dame, we beat Notre Dame by 11 and you dropped us to 3. And now Georgia beats Kent State by 17 and you're not going to drop them at all. But we have this other information. That was week 1. We have this other information of Georgia beating Oregon by 46 points and could have beaten them by 70. Now, there is also this thing that like it's Dan Lanning's first game. Kirby knows him very well. Maybe they weren't ready, but we got to take the win as the win, and that's an impressive data point, like what Ohio State's done to Wisconsin tonight. So if Ohio State did that to Oregon in week 1, I'm not going to go back and revisit these rankings, now that they had an ugly game against Kent State or whoever. There's plenty of time for the rankings to sort themselves out. Right now, Josh, we're just guessing. We don't know. We're just guessing.
Yeah, I mean, we do these top 10s because they're kind of fun. And honestly, I think, and you'll find this if you do it yourself, making yourself actually rank the teams as a thought exercise and look at their records and look at what they've done really forces you to examine where you want to evaluate teams, because it's easy to say that everybody sucks. And I was the one that tweeted today, and it was definitely tongue in cheeks, right? That my professional analysis is that everybody sucks. It's just really easy to say that. It's easy to say that somebody doesn't deserve to be in the top 10. This team doesn't deserve to be in the top 10. This team doesn't deserve to be in the top 10. When you actually make yourself write out 10 teams, which is why we often put it as your homework to do that, you start to realize, hey, there's really not like a 7th best team that's clearly the 7th best team. And for what it's worth, I'm going to have a top 10. So if I do it by myself, I'm happy to do a top 10 this week. And again, there's going to be a couple teams on that list, Oklahoma and USC probably, that are going to be on the ropes when we give that. I don't think this Oklahoma game, which they're currently trailing, is going to end by then. But it just forces you to look at the reality in the eye that no one is really that far and above better than everybody else. And as you called me out on, I think correctly, rarefied air is not really the right term for a top 10 this year. It's just more everybody sort of scratching and clawing over each other, trying to get into that group.
Stephen Light said, and look, man, the chat tonight is keeping it going. And this is why I love having 2 of us. Or if we were like fancy, like Josh Payton had our own producers and crew, and we just had to sit back and talk about what they told us to talk about. The chat is keeping things interesting tonight, and they're keeping us on our toes, and they're driving conversation. Stephen Light says, somewhere in Happy Valley tonight, a smiling Manny Diaz is draining another beer, looking at that Miami score. Josh, we got to talk about this. I felt like Miami was a decent team who lacked explosiveness at wide receiver, and Van Dyke was struggling because of that. Parrish is a good running back, good defense, and then they go out and give up, what was it, 34 to MTSU? What in the world is this? Just some sort of hangover after the A&M game? What's going on?
Yeah, it's a hard one to process because we had the same thought. I really felt like Miami's defense was pretty good. They had played good up to this point, and then they just, I mean, they rolled up an absolute clunker in a lot of different ways. And I mean, it was really bizarre because like Tyler Van Dyke got pulled in the game for Jake Garcia, and Van Dyke was considered in a lot of people one of the better quarterbacks in the country. And we had seen, like last week, they played Miami. They had really bad offensive output. I don't know if this is a reflection of Cristobal, where they come out of Manny Diaz, but it's the same just incredibly temperamental Miami team that we've seen for years, where they just don't show up sometimes. And I mean, some of the stuff is inexcusable. Now I know they're a little bit beat up. I get that. But Cunningham from Middle Tennessee went 408 yards passing on 25 attempts. And I don't know if you can do math, but that's well over 10 yards per attempt. And I'm trying to do it in my head right now, looking at this box score, but that's like, what are we pushing, 15 yards per attempt? And it wasn't just that too. I mean, they didn't run the ball great, but they still ran it okay. They ran for almost 100 yards, take out sacks, and they did run for 100 yards. I think their back end is just bad, and then they got exposed in a way that maybe nobody had been able to expose them defensively. It's a part of it. And I think on the offensive side of the ball, I don't know, Van Dyke is in a real hole. I had noted previously that I thought Restrepo was by far their best receiver, and without him in the roster for a couple weeks, they've just totally curled into a ball. And I think that was maybe a big part of it. But yeah, man, I don't have a full answer. The level of meltdown that they hit today was something else. And yeah, it's one of those things that I don't think you can explain or excuse, other than just Miami being Miami, and some teams just have cultural problems. Cristobal's had games like this throughout his career too, so I'm not sure if that's related to it, but I mean,
yeah, that is
45-31 to Middle Tennessee's not good.
Yeah, so Cristobal has had some knucklehead games. He is a guy that has every step along the way has been on everybody's radar as being a coach they want to steal away from wherever he's at. But he has these knucklehead games, and I don't know why. I think he's kind of a emotional guy in the locker room, and maybe the team feeds off that a little bit for the good, but also for the bad. Benjamin V, and I'm not going to touch on this too much because we get we've gone over playoff stuff in the past, and we've got a lot of ball to talk about. But Benjamin V says 12 teams is better. Week 13, 9-2 versus 9-2 playing for a spot. 8-3 fighting for a playoff spot versus 11-0. Like, late season would be more meaningful. I mean, maybe, but also that means this Appalachian State game that, against Texas A&M means nothing. It means that Michigan could have lost today and it wouldn't really mean anything. It just means a lot of, for me, I look at it like this, Josh. Nobody remembers seminal moments, crazy important moments from NFL regular season. Nobody. If fantasy football did not exist, nobody would watch NFL football except for whatever the market is. So Cleveland Browns would watch their Cleveland Browns. Those fans would watch their team blow leads, but there's the only people that will watch it. In college football, everybody watches everybody play because every week has so much drama. And I just don't think that that's going to happen with 12 teams. Nobody's going to care if a team loses in week 7 that was an upset and that could derail them, because they're not derailed. They can lose a couple more and still make it. And I just hate it.
Yeah, I mean, we've beaten this horse into the ground in a lot of different ways and a lot of different occasions. I think the best argument for the 12-team playoff is really that the bowls, as they currently are, especially the New Year's Six bowls, have just become worthless because everybody opts out of them. And it also forces a conference champion slot to theoretically be worth something. But I think that argument only makes sense if you're talking the abstract, thinking that it is worth something in a 12-team playoff for, I don't know, the Pac-12 champion to get in. If it's, say, Oregon. Let's say Oregon wins the Pac-12. I've seen Oregon play Georgia. That game was not competitive. And what's going to happen is for a couple of years, it's going to take 2 or 3 years, you're going to repeatedly see that these champions are going to get in the playoff and they're going to lose 40-10 in the first round. And the playoff is going to be several rounds now, right? Because you go from 12 to 8 to 4 to 2. It's 4 rounds. If these guys are losing in the first round, this whole idea of it being, this great, exciting, lengthy playoff that you're more involved in. Yeah, you're involved in the first round in a blowout, and then you see 3 more rounds where it's on, literally half or more than half of it is going to be SEC and Big Ten teams. Some of which, like your point, those kick 6 games aren't going to matter at all because those teams, they fall from 2nd to 5th. Who cares? Sometimes it's going to be an advantage to be like 5th because we're going to force 6 champions in, which means the Big 12, which is about to be really neutered without Oklahoma and Texas, may have a really crummy champion. And it means the G5 champion has to make it in every year. And a lot of times those G5 champions aren't very good. And again, Cincinnati, UCF, Houston are all going to the Big 12. So you're going to have a G5 champion other than those teams. And so maybe your number 5 is just going to be blowout city. And it's probably going to be like SEC number 2, Big 10 number 2, that lost the conference championship game, at Georgia last year, and they're just going to just destroy whoever gets that slot in week 1. So I think that, that exciting finish for 8-3, 9-3 teams that we're talking about now. Well, first off, every time you have an exciting game there, that means another game between teams that are already locked in becomes less exciting. It's kind of a zero-sum game. And second, eventually we're going to realize those teams are fighting for a slot that's meaningless because they're going to lose anyway. And that's when I think when it's going to really all kind of start to derail. But that's going to take 3 to 5 years, I think, for people to really, really get that. So I took your 30-second thing and I made it a lot longer, but that's what we do.
David came in with a monster $50 super chat. Thank you so much, David. That's huge. Missed the first few weeks, so he covered the negative news with a huge super chat, but we'll permit it. Love the show. Keep it up, boys. Maybe Maryland isn't terrible, but Michigan looked very questionable today. Defense couldn't get pressure with 4. Worried about Penn State and Ohio State down the road. Go Blue. We covered a lot of Michigan discussion early in this show, but I disagree with you, Josh, a little bit. I think Maryland is better than people think. They're better this year than the brand. And I think that, part of this, I hate to say this because I've been hammering away at this, but Michigan, maybe if you don't play 3 of the worst teams in the country, like legitimately 3 FCS level teams they opened the season with. Colorado State, I think, got blown out by Sacramento State today. How Hawaii lost 63-10 to Vanderbilt. These are really, really bad teams. It's shocking to play a team that's even decent because you haven't had the proper warm-up. You haven't gotten used to speed and space and physicality. And so from that standpoint, I think that it's just, and we saw it in the second half. We saw them come back a lot in the second half. So I think a lot of this is just a slow start versus a team that I think is probably, Maryland, I think they're probably an 8-4 type team this year. I think they're a fringe top 25 team, if nothing else, because of that offense. I don't think their defense is very good. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's anything to be super concerned about unless you're playing Ohio State tomorrow. And if that's the case, you're in trouble.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you there. And I think we really don't know a ton about a lot of these teams. And I do think Maryland is a team that can be very dangerous. Again, my concerns with it really come down to struggles on the offensive and defensive lines, because those are the sorts of things that start to crop up later in the year. But, teams have up games and down games. Like you said, they hadn't really had to deal with live bullets yet. We'll see what kind of team they end up being later.
Casey Knox wanted us to mention that Stephen F. Austin, the Lumberjacks, put up 98 points today against Warner And Josh, the most impressive thing to me is that they put up 98 points on like 590 yards of offense. That to me is the impressive part. They had 4 quarterbacks throw for at least 30 yards. So they let everybody play, but they also didn't stop throwing the ball. They didn't stop scoring. So 98 on 590 yards is tough to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's 14 possessions of touchdowns. It's tough to get in a game that's that big of a blowout and get 14 possessions, but I will also say you have to try to score a lot to do that because at a certain point, usually you turn to the run game, and an average run heavy game, you get about 11 or 12 possessions. So, is what it is, but it's a pretty crazy number.
And that's the note about 4 quarterbacks throwing for at least 30 yards. That means a lot of guys got touches. So Killtack9 says, and this is another great segue because we haven't talked about Alabama yet. Does Bama playing Vanderbilt matter, or should the offense improvements matter? Josh, we had a sidebar discussion about the Bama game earlier, and we noticed that Alabama was they had a very efficient offense, and they scored a lot tonight. They could have scored 70 or 80 if they wanted to. But the impressive thing to me, Josh, was not the points they were scoring or how efficient their offense was, but that they were literally working on stuff. They were not running the offense you're going to see against Arkansas. They were running really kind of awkward stuff, hard stuff, a lot of empty sets, weren't running the ball very much at all. Like Bryce Young had 300 and something yards passing in the first half. They were legitimately working on stuff, which should encourage Alabama fans. What do you think?
No, I think so. And we talked about this with Ohio State week 1, and I think Alabama's getting there. There are things you can see in a game where you can tell a team's just not really in rhythm or things aren't clicking. And Ohio State wasn't playing great offense. And this Wisconsin game, look, I wasn't surprised that they blew out Wisconsin. That was kind of our prediction. But they're in rhythm now. CJ Stroud is in rhythm, and he's hitting guys on time. And I don't really care who the opponent is. Just like we talked about Georgia versus Oregon. Oregon made things easy, but Georgia took the easy things in rhythm. There's a big difference where Alabama was at for the first quarter and a half. I had that game really in my focus and the sort of in this off to the side to see what they look like and what they've looked like the past few weeks. Alabama's rhythm is much better. They're throwing the ball on time. The receivers were running the routes in line with where the quarterback expected to be, where they were hitting holes in the zone and little stupid things like that. The same way that CJ Stroud is doing that now versus, as we said, against the Notre Dame game, they weren't doing that. And guys were constantly sort of out of sync and out of rhythm. And I'll also say their offensive line looks a lot better. One thing I will say with Alabama, this was an interesting factoid I only recently ran around, and I was going to bring it up at some point, so I might as well bring it up now. I did not really fully appreciate that Alabama is leading the country in rushing, yard per carry average. They may not have total yardage, but they came in tonight running the ball at 7.6 yards per carry, which is a pretty crazy number. It's about a half yard per carry better than Kansas, who is the next best team. And it's over a yard a carry better than the best SEC team behind them, which was Florida. And they haven't shown much signs of stopping. So the crazy thing with all their problems, they're actually running the ball really well. They just weren't throwing in rhythm. And if they get throwing the ball in rhythm, that offense is going to explode. And Ohio State and Alabama are going to go back to the kind of crazy offenses we've seen for the past couple of years. So I do think it matters. Alabama at some point will get in rhythm. If they do get in rhythm, they're going to be a juggernaut because I do think they have the best defense in the country to pair with it. Their potential is higher than any other team in the country. And it's just a matter of how much consistency and production they can get out of their passing game, really.
We got a question from a Josh, and I'm going to make it to a Josh. Shout out to CFB Nerds for providing an entertaining stream. As always, is Kansas the best team in the Big 12 this year? Josh, I got a sneak peek at your top 10, and there's a team that's not in there that you probably, I think you would put ahead of Kansas if they played today, and that'd be Oklahoma State. So maybe I'll let you tackle that question. I think Kansas is fun. I like Kansas and their story this year, but I'm not ready to crown them Big 12 champs. What do you think?
Yeah, football is always sort of an exercise in matchups and schedule and whatnot. And Kansas is, I think, sort of a byproduct of the things that got them to where they are today. So, like, I think they're a very good football team. I think they're the best Kansas football team in a long time. But when you start to sort of hyperanalyze a team that won in overtime versus a West Virginia team that's not particularly good, beat Houston, didn't thump them, but beat them pretty soundly, beat Duke in what was a pretty close game. I watched some of that game, and quite frankly, the defenses were not particularly good. They're good. They're reasonably sound. They're not gonna finish the top team in the Big 12. To be frank, I don't think they will finish the top 4 team in the Big 12, but they'll probably finish an average team in the top 12 in the Big 12. I think it's just the reality of a very backloaded schedule is going to come back to bite Kansas, but it is really fun to talk about while we can that there's a 4-0 Kansas out there.
So Kiltack had another super chat. Hendon Hooker a legitimate QB? He seems like one of the best mobile QBs. I'll say this, and this is going to frustrate some Arkansas fans, but none of them are listening right now because they couldn't kick a field goal tonight. I think Hendon Hooker is a better version of KJ Jefferson. What do you like? I think we both think he's a legitimate QB. We've been on him for a couple of years now, but how much? Maybe a better question is how much is the offense making him look good versus him making the offense look good?
A little of A and a little B. Jefferson's a bit of a unique guy because he's so big, but Hooker is a good runner, just natural runner, which is, we talk sometimes there's quarterbacks that are mobile and there's quarterbacks that are runners, which is a little different to be able to cut and move, take a hit and that kind of thing. I think their offense does a ton for them because of the pace, because of how much they get guys isolated downfield. And it is a little bit boom or bust. And my big thing with Tennessee, we've seen it the past few years. I think we'll see it again this year because I think it's just sort of endemic to Heupel's offense. A lot like the Briles offense, if you want to draw the comparison to Arkansas, when it's clicking, it can be really good. But it can also be a three and out machine. And what you saw subtly going on in that Tennessee game is they were 87 plays from Florida to 70 from Tennessee. And when you get up near 90 plays, stuff starts to stack against you. I think that Tennessee offense, when they get people on their heels, man, they can churn out yards and then they pop one over the top. Hooker is good enough to run that offense at a pretty high level. I think he's a pretty darn good quarterback. Josh Dobbs level, maybe quarterback. But I think if they slowed things down a little bit, I think they would have trouble because they wouldn't have guys so out of rhythm, and the consistency, which is sometimes an issue for Hooker, would be more apparent. And I also think that you're going to see certain times with Tennessee, maybe Georgia, maybe Alabama, where they're going to struggle offensively to get going, and suddenly he's going to go into a complete shell because that offense is going to start going into 3-and-out city, and they're going to have to slow down, and he's going to look like a completely different player. So that's kind of their problem, is there's going to be, I think their style of offense kind of hits a ceiling versus certain quality defenses. And Florida, frankly, was not that quality of a defense. So that was kind of the underlying point.
Quasar 0121, FSU fan, ACC dark horse maybe. So I want to look up the score real quick because I was really, at the point Florida State was winning 24-0 over Boston College, and they're 4-0 now, right? So let's see, that game's still going. Actually, let's see what the score is. It's 44-7, so they're going to be 4-0. Boston College is sadly bad. I wish they were good because that's a good brand name, and I like when BC is good. But Josh, Florida State is doing something this year that's been the missing piece from Florida State in years past, and that's being able to dominate bad teams. We talk about this a lot. There is a lot you can learn from teams who play bad teams and dominate or struggle. There's information that you can get. 44-7 over Boston College, even if Boston College is bad in I think the third quarter, is a big deal to me. 35-31 on the road at Louisville, I don't think is a terrible outcome because I think Louisville is a decent team. I don't think Louisville is as bad as they have been in recent past. They got that win on what really was the road at LSU, and Duquesne's terrible. But Josh, when you think about the ACC right now, and I think that you're pretty high on NC State. Where does Florida State fit in there for you?
Well, that's the struggle with the ACC right now, and I'm kind of high on NC State by default. That Wake Forest Clemson game was not only was it down to the wire, and I'm curious if you agree with me on this. It was down to the wire because the separation between Clemson and Wake Forest wasn't that great. Do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, correct.
And Clemson is a team that they're gonna have to flirt with a top 5 ranking because who the hell else do you put there? But when you start going down the list and you talk about Wake, I think I don't know that Wake's a great team. I think Hartman had some really. I know we have very different opinions, which is interesting on him as a quarterback. I thought, while I think he made some really gutsy throws moving outside the pocket, I also felt like he leaves a ton on the football field and he misses a ton in terms of stuff he doesn't see, and he misses a ton of his throws downfield. I think NC State's potential is
Hartman's
the best.
like 12 yards an attempt today and 5 touchdowns. I just can't. I'm not against a Clemson defense that clearly isn't as good as we thought it was, but like there's nothing I'm taking away from that that's bad. I'll save that for when he throws up a 7.7 and 2 interceptions and 2 touchdowns against Florida State. But for today, I'm giving Hartman his due.
Yeah, I guess that's fair, but he didn't have that kind of an average against Liberty last week. I think it was like 8 yards per attempt, something like that against Liberty in a 37-36 win. So I think, frankly, Clemson's back end has a lot more problems than people are currently giving them credit for. But that really all comes into the fact, right, that Miami looks awful. I think Pitt has a lot of falls and faults, and the injury to Slovis really has kind of crippled them. NC State is the one team that I think potentially could be pretty good. But, I mean, who else do you want to say is just clearly so awesome that Florida State can't beat them? I don't think there's an answer to that. I think the ACC is as wide open as it ever was. The big difference, I think, is really just that frankly, the rest of the country is a little bit down. And so the ACC, I think, maybe a little better than they have been in previous years, and everybody else is a little bit worse. So they're more nationally relevant. And Florida State's right in that conversation. They've got a lot of kinks they still got to work out, but they're playing pretty good football.
All right. So Benjamin V says, thank you so much for responses. First time tuning in live. Your previews and Saturday shows make NCAA football season so much better. Can't wait for this week's previews. Go Blue. Benjamin, thank you so much for the kind words. And I do want to touch on this because, Josh, the live show is tough for us. I've got 3 small kids. We watch a lot of football. We've got busy weekends. We work real hard during the week. This is so much fun for me. Like, I genuinely love doing this. And it started like we did a top 10 before we did these live shows. And the thing I noticed when we did the top 10 was that it was fun because we just talk ball. We just talk about the sport. We don't have these like structured, segmented things that we have to do with previews, which those are still fun. But I love the live shows, man. So I'm glad that we get to do it because it's late. It's super late for Josh. He's on the East Coast. But yeah, these are a lot of fun. Any other thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, we often have commented that when we talk back and forth in prepping to record our shows, I think sometimes that conversation is probably better than what made it into the actual video. And this kind of gives us the opportunity to do that because we do follow a lot of football as closely as we can. And we have a lot of organic conversation. And I think sometimes when you do a preview, because I don't know how many times, and I'm sure you guys have seen it in the comments, people talk about, you didn't talk about X player or Y player or this matchup or that matchup. And you feel like you have to check all these boxes, and you kind of do have to check them all off. You don't get to just talk as organically as you'd like. And this lets us do that in a better context. But yeah, it can be a little bit of a challenge here on the East Coast. I saw the SpaceX rocket a couple hours ago. I went to grab dinner. It was kind of fun. So
That was a hard
East Coast world.
segue.
Yeah, it was just, I was just thinking that East Coaster out here getting late at night, but that was actually kind of wild. I saw something streaking through the sky, and sure enough, it was the SpaceX rocket.
All right, Josh. So you said you were going to do a top 10. I wrote a top 10 down. Let's take a stab at it with the caveat for all y'all that are listening on Sunday and USC lost. Josh has got USC in his top 10. So that could kind of throw things a little bit sideways, but y'all, we got to get these done. We can't record again on Sunday, a top 10 Sunday morning, and then record Sunday night. Our wives would kill us. That's way too much. So we're going to do a top 10 now. We're going to get it out Sunday morning. There's the caveat. Josh first. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I can. And I will say Oklahoma basically just sealed their loss now. Kansas State sealed the win for them. But yeah, I'll go forward and do my top 10. You want me to start number 1 or number 10?
Go number 1.
So my number 1 remains Georgia. I think Georgia's performance today wasn't great, but as we talked about, it was just one of those games where they got on the wrong side of the turnover chain. We're -4, I think, in turnovers in the first half, but they still put up 39 points. I have a little bit of concern from that 22 points scored and how it was scored, because Kent State did move the ball legitimately on Georgia, and you saw some chinks in the armor, some places where they haven't completely reloaded, I think, as well. And I think those will get fleshed out a little more in SEC play, and you'll start to see that they do have some areas where they can be attacked, but they're still the most complete team. Offensively, they have the best rhythm of anyone in the country. They need A.D. Mitchell back from injury, I think, a little bit, but otherwise, I think they're still the most well-rounded team. My number 2 is Ohio State. Took a big step forward against Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin's a team where they have a lot of matchup advantages. We talked about that in our preview, where, I picked Ohio State to win by a pretty significant margin, but they were dominant, and their defense is starting to really show up, and they had a lot of plays behind the line of scrimmage. They were really dominating physically on that side of the ball, and then offensively, they're completely in rhythm. My number 3 is Alabama. Kind of in the same boat. Those two teams, Ohio State and Alabama, are closing the gap fast, I think, with Georgia in terms of overall quality. There was a big gap 2 weeks ago, and I don't think there is now. Alabama was playing a bad Vandy team, not nearly as bad as they have been. They're actually somewhat decent, but still bad. But they were just completely in rhythm. And in a way, even they weren't, we talked about the opening week of Utah State. It's a big jump from Utah State to this year's Vandy. And they looked better today than they looked then, from at least the part that I got to watch. And defensively, I think they're probably the best defensive unit in the country. Nobody's really done much of anything other than one quarter of scripted plays from Texas, throwing to 5 stars with a 5-star quarterback, and we don't really know what that means yet. My number 4 is Michigan. And Michigan is one of the harder teams to evaluate, I think, because they did not play a P5 out of conference. I think they were a little bit shell-shocked in that Maryland game. I was very concerned with how the defensive and offensive lines really didn't get a lot of push or didn't get a lot of disruption. At times, Talia Tagovailoa had an eternity to throw from Maryland. And yeah, they got beat somewhat in the secondary. They struggled with explosive plays. All that's sort of bad, but the core pieces are what alarm me the most. I will say J.J. McCarthy did not look good. I don't know if that's a one-off or that's who he is, but if that is who he is, their number 4 ranking is going to be in question. However, I say that knowing the rest of my list isn't going to be that pretty. My number 5 is Clemson. I think Clemson, again, another team that has a lot of chinks in the armor. I thought their defense, when their front got to the quarterback, looked really good. And when they didn't, they looked surprisingly average on the back end. I don't think they're particularly good on the back end of that defense. Offensively, you can see all the same inconsistencies we've been seeing for a while. Wake Forest is a bad defense, and they still didn't score a ton. So I kind of have Clemson there sort of kind of by default, mainly due to the strength of that defense. And I will say if they get better quarterback play, Clemson is the one that could, I think, improve the most in terms of quality and could easily charge. Really, the one team I think that can challenge the top three, but that's a big if, and that also depends upon the defense showing up. My number, where are we on now? Number 6 is Baylor. Baylor gutted out a tough win against a pretty good Iowa State team, not a great one. I think they have some flaws, but they're a solid team. And at this point, you're going to start seeing pretty quickly the pickings get pretty slim. I don't love everything I see from them. I think defensively, they get pushed around a lot more than they did last year. Offensively, they still have some ability to put more pop out there than I think maybe the brand necessarily gets credit for. I think they're just a pretty solid all-around team. I'm not sure that I'm sold that Baylor's going to stay in that slot. Now I'm sort of second guessing myself because I think I put the wrong team at number 6. I don't know. We'll see. Baylor with their loss probably shouldn't be there. I completely forgot that they lost to LSU. That's what happens when you record live. My number 7 is Tennessee. I'm going to throw in another number 6 here in a minute once I second guess what I was doing because I just remember they lost that game. Tennessee, I thought, showed their explosiveness on offense. I think their defense has as many sort of warts as they did last year. I think they can be run on. Obviously, they can be run on. I think they probably can be thrown on a lot more by a team that's better than Florida, and Florida did throw the ball on them pretty successfully with a bad quarterback. But offensively, they were one of the better teams in the country. They're one of the few teams that hasn't lost a game. Hard to have them any lower. USC, I have at number 8. Consider it by default because I don't know what's going to happen tonight, and I think their potential on the offensive side of the ball is such that it keeps them in that top 10. Assuming they win, they're going to be up there with anybody else. I think Oregon State's a pretty good team, so there's not a huge shame in the fact that they're not blowing them out immediately. My number 9 is Kentucky, and this is where you start to really get into by default. They did not look great today, but they do have, something of a pretty decent resume. That win over Florida means something. I think they're a pretty good all-around team. They have a pretty good defense. They've got a quarterback that is capable of playing at a high level, though I think he's more inconsistent than people give him credit for. And my number 10 is NC State. NC State is, I think, just sort of quietly sitting there under the radar. There are a lot of people that had NC State as being one of the better teams in the country and a dark horse playoff contender early in the season. I didn't see it to start the year. I'm seeing it a little more now. So with NC State, sort of being where they are, yeah, I think it makes sense for them to be number 10. And I'm sort of scouring, knowing that I kind of messed up with Baylor. I guess Oklahoma State is probably the team I should have slotted in there.
I was going to give you, I was going to tell you Oklahoma State because that's who I have at number 6, by the way, from the Big 12 is Oklahoma State. And I think that that's probably the better fit. Before I get into mine, I got a question for you. And this isn't fair. This is kind of a gotcha. But if Michigan played Tennessee today, who wins that game?
If Michigan played Tennessee today, do you mean like if they played right now, or if you mean if they played like they played today?
No. If those two teams played on a neutral site today, who are you picking to win that game?
If they were to play next week, I think if I were to set the odds, I would set the odds in Michigan's favor, not by a ton, probably like by -6 or something. If they played like they played today, Tennessee would have beaten Michigan.
Yeah. So I think that, and here's the thing, and this is, and my first 3, Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, those are my first 3. I'll blow through them pretty quickly. Ohio State was super dominant. I really like what you said about how Ohio State and Alabama are closing the gap on Georgia. And I think that's the perfect way to put it. I think we almost have a 1A, B, and C. The thing that was most impressive about Alabama today, and to an extent the same with Ohio State, is not the offense, it's the defense. Vanderbilt is not a good football team, but they scored 25 legitimate points on Wake Forest. They scored 63 on Hawaii. Like, they've been and if you watch the tape schematically, they're a very interesting offense. Alabama held them to 3 points. That was impressive to me. I thought Alabama would beat them 66-17 kind of thing. 3 points. That was impressive. Anyway, those are the 3 teams that are going to sort it out in the playoffs. So whatever. Number 4, I've got Tennessee, and I don't have a lot of confidence about this pick, but Tennessee has a win against a pretty good Pitt team and a win against a Florida team who I think figured a lot of things out offensively today. And yes, Florida put on some late, like, dramatic touchdowns or whatever when Tennessee was trying to salt it away, running the ball up the middle. But Tennessee won that game, and I think it was a lot. It wasn't nearly as close as the final score indicates. I think they would have beaten Michigan if they played today, and part of that is because at this point in the year, based on how Michigan played against Maryland, we're giving Michigan a whole lot of credit going into week 5 based on what they did last year. That's the only way I can put it at this point. Because we can't judge them on their first 3 games, because what they did is no better than what a lot of bad Power 5 teams could do against that schedule. The one game we have to judge them against, there were some real issues and some concerns I have, especially at quarterback. But I still think that they have a pretty good roster. So I've got Tennessee 4, Michigan number 5. I've got Oklahoma State number 6. I like Sanders a lot at quarterback. They beat this Central Michigan team worse than Penn State beat them today. Yes, Central Michigan scored 44. It was like 50-17 or something when the scrubs went in. Now, I think that speaks to depth on Oklahoma State's side, but that wasn't a legitimate 44 points. Oklahoma State, to me, is the team that's probably the best team in the Big 12, and I think that they deserve that number 6 slot. Like you with Kentucky, it's real shaky. I've got them at number 7. I don't love putting them here. I think that, what they did defensively against Florida was probably more impressive than we gave them credit for, but offensively, I don't love them, man. 31 today against Northern Illinois, 8-point win, I think it was, which is also not great for a top 10 team. But again, who else are you going to put in there? Because resume counts too. I've got Clemson down at number 8. I don't like, the thing for me is I'm not wild about their offense, but I also like the thing that had them up high for me was that defense. And I do not like their defense anymore, given what they did against Wake Forest today. And look, Wake Forest has got a good offense, but they're scoring about the same against Clemson as they did against Vanderbilt. Come on. That's not good, because Vanderbilt's defense, we saw it today against Alabama, is trash. So I've got some concerns with Clemson, but I agree with you in that they've got the roster of all the teams in the top 10 that could make the jump up to the top 4. Penn State is my number 9. I think they've earned it. I think they earned it with that win at Auburn, even though I think Auburn is a bad team. Going on the road, beating them as bad as they did is impressive. And I've actually got Minnesota at number 10. I'm impressed with what they did today on the road at Michigan State. I do not think Michigan State is a good team, but again, the ability to dominate bad teams, especially on the road, which Penn State and Minnesota have done, is something that at this point in the year deserves credit. Anybody else in this top 10, in my opinion, is based on making a lot of assumptions about who they can be or their brand name, and I don't want to do that yet. So that's my top 10, and USC might end up blowing out Oregon State, but right now it's 3-7 at the half, and they look pretty bad. So maybe they'll jump back in there next week, but this is who I've got right now. Josh, tell me, who's the team outside of your top 10 that could still make a lot of noise this year?
Gosh, and I will say, I wanted to note there were a lot of people laughing about Tennessee for you number 4, but I'd make the point, like you said, I mean, the way they played today, Tennessee would have beaten Michigan, and they would have beaten Clemson too. So outside the top 4, as I watch Kansas State recover the onside kick, it's NC State, I think. Well, I guess they're in my top 10. Outside my top 10, or outside your top 10, or outside
of your top 10, Who could you see making some noise? Is it Baylor since you've removed them? You've jettisoned them from your top 10 during this discussion?
Yeah, I got them. Oklahoma State didn't play this week, and I got them temporarily mixed up, especially since they just played Iowa State tough in my head as I was ranking them out. Gosh. The one team I think that really isn't on a lot of radars is probably Ole Miss right now, which is kind of interesting. They're floating out there. They destroyed Georgia Tech. They kind of had a tough opener with Troy, but they still pulled away from them. And then this Tulsa game ended up being pretty close, but Tulsa's actually a decent team this year. I don't know if maybe that's the answer to it. Oklahoma's one that just went down. That's not a bad team just because they had this loss. Though maybe this sort of points to the fact that Kansas State has been annoying. I think the truth of the matter is you could point to about a dozen teams outside of these top 10s that are capable of beating teams in the top 10s. Like I think Penn State and Minnesota are certainly capable of being in the top 10 in 2 weeks. I don't know what my top 10 is going to look like. I think it's going to be extremely variable throughout the entire year.
Can I give you one, Josh, that maybe we should think about?
Sure. Yeah.
Utah.
See, I don't know. I'm not as sold on Utah. I think they're a good team. I think they lost a game against Florida that they probably shouldn't have lost. But I don't know. I think they've got some faults. I don't think the passing game is great. I think they're kind of a one-dimensional team, and they're going to look really good against the teams they look good against, and then they're going to be certain teams where they look just completely flat. And it's going to depend so much on matchups and so much on how much you can lean on Cam Rising and his ability to run the ball at a quarterback position. I think they're a lot like Florida, honestly, that both those teams kind of are going to be totally boom or bust on whether or not what they want to do with their quarterback works, because they're kind of unique pieces. And when it doesn't work on the other side of the ball, they both kind of have some holes and limitations, I think, that can get them in a position where they can lose to a lot of people. But they can certainly beat a lot of people too.
Yeah, it's tough for me because I think that we overreact with week 1 games, but they're about to go up 21-0 on Arizona with 9 minutes left in the first or second quarter. So I'm kind of impressed by that. It's also on the road. Again, Arizona State's not a good football team, but this year, I think this is going to be a theme. There's the parity thing that we've wanted for a while, I feel like is here outside of the top couple of teams. There's a lot of fun to be had in watching games of the 15th best team to the 50th best team. I think there's a lot of fun there that people aren't paying attention to. And I do think that Florida State has the opportunity to make a little bit of noise this year. Isaac Adkins said, any thoughts on USC games so far? 3 points in 1/2 is kind of crazy. I'd like for you to touch on this one, Josh, because you've got them in your top 10 and I do not. It is kind of crazy, but is this USC thing similar to the Michigan thing in that they haven't played anybody yet? They finally played a decent, not great team with a pulse, and they're a little bit jarred early on.
It can be. I'm not going to lie. The problem for us doing this live show with these Pac-12 kickoffs, I have not gotten to see hardly any of the USC game versus Oregon State. That's one I'm going to have to mostly catch up on the replay. I have never been as nearly as high on Caleb Williams as a lot of people are. I'm actually not sold. In fact, if you had made me pick, I think Dylan Gabriel, in my view, might be a better quarterback than Caleb Williams. I think the big thing in that game, more than anything, is like a lot of teams this year, because of the way that the rules are structured, because of how much the game now depends upon your ability to throw the ball and leverage the RPO. When Caleb Williams is not in rhythm, that team will struggle. And I don't know. I really are going to have to go back and look at it. But just from off the cuff, I would say it doesn't shock me to see him playing poorly, because there were several games last year at Oklahoma where he played terribly. And he got super hyped from that Texas game. But later on in the season, they really struggled in some games because of Caleb Williams. And there were points where Rattler was brought in for Williams because he was outplaying him. So I think you're going to see the same thing. I think there were a lot of assumptions made that they would just necessarily grind everything out every week with Caleb Williams, but it's the same quarterback with the same offensive coordinator that we saw last year that had struggle. So it doesn't shock me, but I do think with his ability to run the football and knowing where the Pac-12 is at defensively, they'll probably more often than not pull things together. It's a lot like, frankly, it's a lot like Kansas State right now that just beat Oklahoma with Adrian Martinez, who
he's been terrible this year.
Yeah, I mean, he's been a terrible quarterback. At Tulane last week, he threw for 4.8 yards per attempt. Missouri was 5.1. South Dakota was 3.5 yards per attempt. He's been a horrible passer all year, and he shows up in this Oklahoma game and just absolutely gives them fits. It's some of these guys just are very, very up and down, and I think Caleb Williams is one of them, and I think you're going to see that from USC. They're going to lay a few eggs, probably 3 to 4 eggs offensively, and I just don't know. I don't know whether that's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how much it's going to matter. It's too early to tell right now.
What's crazy is, and everybody talks about USC struggling in Corvallis, and this is a thing for them, which I'm not big on that. I don't like the whole this X team loses at this place, because just because a team lost somewhere 20 years ago or 15 years ago or 10 years ago or has some bad luck there, those are old teams. Nobody playing on the team now cares. I remember some Auburn fans and some Alabama fans talking about the Iron Bowl and Tuscaloosa, because it used to be a neutral site game, and then it went to just Tuscaloosa, and then I think Alabama lost the first one there or whatever when they decided to move it to the stadiums, and the stat was like Alabama's never beaten Auburn either in Auburn or in Tuscaloosa in like 100 years or something like that. And I'm like, yeah, they've played 4 times. Like, nobody playing on these squads now cares about any of that. But what I wanted to say in all of that is, it's interesting to me that USC might lose this game and their defense has only given up 7 points. In the past, in this game, it's been a high scoring kind of nutty affair. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because in my mind, a Lincoln Riley team that can give up 7 points and a half, and it's, there's 11 minutes left in the third quarter, that's a good thing for SC, for the thing that, like, we expect them to have offense. So maybe they drop this game, or maybe they win it ugly. But Josh, is there a silver lining here if you're a USC fan, in that, let's say they win this game 13-10, that, hey, maybe we can play some defense, and with Lincoln Riley at the helm, we're going to figure the offense out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're going to figure a lot of things out. And the biggest thing is they have a run game. And I often say that the ability to run the ball successfully is the thing that lets you overcome clunkers. It's the thing that lets you beat teams that you're better than on a consistent basis. And between Williams and Dye, I think they're going to be able to run the ball. I don't think they're going to lose the game personally. And I think they can figure some things out. But yeah, it's certainly interesting, if nothing else.
To circle back on A&M's win, Ace Man, who is a big friend of the program, always shows up. I don't know if he's still on, because he was on early. He wanted to shout out about his Aggies, and we are giving you that shout out now. Josh did pick your Aggies to win, which it's interesting, because I made a note in our preview, Josh. I said, look, I don't know why A&M's favored based on their production to date, but you're kind of a snob about favorites, and you picked A&M to win that game, and they won. This is just another example to me, Josh, that, and look, Vegas doesn't know that A&M is going to get a muffed punt against Miami to score a touchdown, or a goal line fumble returned for a touchdown against Arkansas, but they still won. And with all of the, it felt like the public money and the public interest was on Arkansas. Vegas knows what they're doing, Josh. We learned this time and time again. Vegas knows what they're doing, and I think we learned that again this weekend.
Yeah, they do. You call me, it's kind of funny to be a snob for favorites. They're favorites for a reason. If you're going to pick straight up in a league, and I've said before, I played around with this, in a straight up pick 'em. If you pick the favorite every time, you're probably going to finish no worse than second or third in your league. People pick upsets way more often than they actually happen. And the thing is, upsets do happen. But if you have a slate of 10 games, yeah, there's going to be one or two upsets. But if you were to try to pick out which one they are, you're far more likely to pick the wrong one. You got like an 8 out of 10 chance of picking the wrong one and only a 2 out of 10 chance of picking the right one. So most of the time you pick the wrong one and you fail to pick the upset. So you miss on both. But yeah, no, that game had A&M favored for a reason. There were matchup problems. There's talent problems. And people, I think, have a very, very bad thing in their minds where if a team loses to App State, they're terrible, they have to lose the next game. And that's not how football works. It's not how any sport really works. Just because you lost this other game doesn't like decrease your team rating to where you're going to lose the next one. That's not real life. A&M lost a really bad, ugly game against Appalachian State where they played terribly. They made a quarterback change. They've improved somewhat on offensively. They still had a very good defense, just like they did in the App State game. They could have easily lost to Arkansas, but they, played differently than they did a few weeks prior. I don't think they're a great football team, but they're still a pretty good one, even though they have a bad loss. It's just kind of the way things go sometimes.
So, Josh, I think a lot of this too, though, and we've taken a lot of heat about this on this show this year. I think a lot of this is that Vegas also saw in Arkansas kind of what we've seen in Arkansas, having left them out of our top 10s, much to the chagrin of Arkansas fans who keep telling us, Pate's high on Arkansas and y'all are just haters. I think some of that spread was less about A&M and a lot about what they don't love about Arkansas.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. We've talked about it a lot. There's a lot of weird sensitivity with Texas A&M as a football team and ranking them and where you rank them in recent years. We've tried to be very fair to them. And it's funny that we vacillated either from being Texas A&M lovers that everyone hates us on us because we include them in a top 10 or top 15 to the past couple of weeks. We were like the world's greatest Texas A&M bashers, or at least I was talking about their offense after the first week or two. It's funny. I don't know that there's another team in the country that has such a seesaw and so much just volatility of emotion in the way you rank them and consider them. And I feel like every game that you evaluate involving Texas A&M ends up involving those concepts to some extent.
Javari Williams with another super chat. What happened to the drinks? Didn't there used to be some whiskey on the show? Yes, of course there's whiskey on the show. I've got a tighter camera angle now than I've had in the past, so you can't see it. And this just shows also that I don't abuse it. I'm still on the 1920 that I've been on for a minute. I did just finish some Wild Turkey, I think it's Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit that I liked a lot too. If anybody out there can find some Knob Creek 12, I would pay a pretty penny for it because I can't find it anywhere. So yeah, Javari Williams, we do still have on the show. Josh is dry, probably because he's about to go to bed. We've got about 17 minutes. I do want to finish the second part of this question. 17 minutes because I say 11. We always go over a little bit. There's a huge push for kids to go to HBCs. Do you think HBCs will make it to the Power 5? Go Blue. Josh, I don't think they will, but I do think that there is, I think what Deion's doing is great. And I think that some NIL money going into the HBCs to push these kids to HBCs is great. And I think it's going to get better. But the problem is the jump from HBC to P5 from the amount of money that it takes to run a program at that level. I just don't know that outside of like Howard, there's a lot of HBCs that are big enough to actually pull that off. Because, you think about like what a good game and what a packed stadium looks like for an HBC versus what a packed stadium for, an Alabama or Tennessee is. And they need that packed stadium of 80 to 100,000 people to keep that P5 going. And they just don't have that big enough of a fan base, I think, in these HBCs to do that at that level. And I think that's the biggest thing that would stop them. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. Dave Valinsky at one point had asked, the way the Sun Belt is playing, do we think that they're the best non-P5 conference? Which I think this year the answer is yes. And I think it certainly could be that way going forward, given how many AAC teams in particular are jumping to the P5. But I bring this up to note that when you talk about the HBCUs and sort of elevating them, it's not just getting them to the P5, but there's a whole lot of other good programs out there that struggle to compete with the P5s already. And I don't mean compete really so much even on the football field as I mean financially and in facilities and booster support. Operating a major FBS program is insanely expensive and difficult. And UAB folded a couple years ago and had to be resurrected. And there's a reason for that. It's just very, very hard financially to run. And there's a lot of dynamics when you talk about HBCs where they struggle sometimes to finance the way that they want to finance to be able to operate and offer as many scholarships as they want to offer and have dormitories and all that kind of stuff. And those things are what drives a successful football program. So you can send NIL money, and I think that could help some be really successful at a certain level. But if you really want to take the next step and be overly successful, you're going to need a $200 million stadium, and you're going to need $150 million dormitory and practice facility and athletic facility. And you're going to need, like $10 million, $20 million a year in expenditures for player support and development. I mean, we're talking like $500 million. Like, it's a lot of money. There's a reason teams don't climb up the ladder very often. And the ones that have climbed up a little bit, UCF's an example. UCF is the largest college in the United States.
Right. Their enrollment's like 60K.
Yeah, it's not an accident that UCF slowly came up. And it's true of a lot of others like Houston. It's a big college in a big town with a lot of money and supporters. They've been around a long time. They have a lot of alumni already. It's tough to climb up. So my answer to the HBCUs is really the same answer I give to most programs, which is if you think that something's going to happen where Sun Belt teams are going to make this jump or a lot of other teams are going to make this jump, more often than not, you're probably wrong because you just underestimate the jump that it will take. And all at the same time you're trying to make that jump, everybody else is investing too. And the SEC and the Big Ten are about to make a lot more TV money than they've been making. So it's going to be even that much harder to catch them. If anything, I see the P5 becoming really a P2 or maybe a P3 and them kind of running away from where everybody else is. And it's going to be even more difficult to break in. And if anything, I think teams are going to break off and fall out of FBS more than teams are going to jump into it.
And here's one thing I do think we're going to see, and I will say about this for HBCs in the recent visibility and increase of money that's going there. I don't think it's going to be enough for them to get into major college football at that level as a team. But I think what we're going to see, Josh, and I'll let you weigh in on this, is we're going to see more individual talent go there because you can afford to effectively sponsor someone to play in an HBC versus going to a P5. And that'll get more of these players into the NFL. So I do think that we're going to see more good high school players go to HBCs and more good HBC players go to the NFL.
I do agree with that, but it's going to be interesting to see how far that goes, right? Because it's going to be if you're an individual player in that situation and you're trying to make the best decision for yourself, there's a lot of draws with wanting to go to an HBC to support them. You get NIL money. There's a lot of organizations that are more than eager to support you in going there and telling your story. But if you're a really high profile player, you also have in the back of your mind, but I want exposure and the best development and training possible because I want to be able to go to the NFL and go in the first round and make a $50 million contract. And so there's kind of this balancing act because there's a lot of money and there's a lot of exposure and all that. All that combined might be worth a few $1 million. And if you're a really high level player, you're probably shooting for tens of millions of dollars. So I think you will see some individual players go. I don't think you'll see a massive players go, which will kind of put a damper on how far they'll go. And it could end up sort of in a weird, disjointed situation where you see like some really, really high profile talents like we currently have at Jackson State. And then a lot of like the rest of the recruiting class is just the same as it's always been. And so, how much does that affect a team or not affect a team? I don't know. It's a really odd dynamic that I don't think anybody's quite sure yet how it's going to pan out.
Yeah, I agree. I do think it's better because it's easier to get one or two players on a team, get them some money, than it is to elevate an entire program to the next level. Uplifting community ask, and I wanted to touch on this earlier because we talked about a team that's outside of our top 10 that could make some noise. For me, it's Washington. And I'm not sold, Josh, on them being there yet. I think that they handled Michigan State. That was good. They're killing Stanford right now. They're going to start the season 4-0. And then if they can beat UCLA next week, then they've got Arizona State and Arizona who they will beat before they play a California team that's decent. They'll be 7-0 to start the season. I think Washington has the chance to be a legitimately good team this year, at least with win-loss record. Like, I could see them going 10-2 this year. And for me, as someone who's wanted Washington to be good for, since 2016, since they were good and they played Alabama in the playoffs, like that's a program that I think makes college football healthy. When you think about Washington in general, what have you seen? And do you think that they're going to have a decent season, or are they kind of a paper tiger?
Well, it's kind of funny because looking back and evaluating them now is kind of tough because they opened against Kent State and didn't look great, and now Kent State's sort of viewed as a better football team. And then they go in last week and they win against Michigan State 39-28, which everybody's saying, oh, well, that's a pretty good big time win. And I think people probably view Kent State as being the better win than Michigan State as of this week. So it's hard to evaluate them, but I do agree with you. It's kind of, frankly, if I'm being completely honest, this is the problem with the entire Pac-12 is that the Pac-12 is just not particularly good. And evaluating everybody in the Pac-12 sort of feels like this weird game of trying to make like really strange projections, knowing almost like they're playing in a different league. And what I ultimately think will be the case because they have Penix Jr. is that they're going to be a little up and down because what we always saw in Indiana with him, when he was on, he could be as good as anybody. Yep. He's one of those guys that can make any throw on the field, and he can also miss any throw on the field. And so that's kind of what I'm expecting
he put
from
up
Washington
like
this year.
38 on that 2020 Ohio State team that killed Clemson and played Alabama in the national championship game.
Yep, he did. And then later, he got banged up, but I think, last year he came back and with all that hype. And we had talked about even that season that we'd always seen that with him. And the next year he came back and was really, really hot and cold and ended up losing not only the height, but also losing the inside track on his job. So,
Josh, you talk about this Pac-12, and this is interesting because USC was supposed to be the standard bearer for the Pac-12 this year. They're supposed to be the team that maybe could make the playoffs, and they've got the brand and they've got the coach. They just scored in the fourth quarter to make it 10-7 against Oregon State. I mean, I feel like we might have a situation where like a one-loss Pac-12 team makes it to the playoffs, but they're going to be absolutely exposed if they play any of the other three: Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State. So I'm right there with you, and I think this is what gets us into a little bit of trouble when we start thinking about Power 5 teams in the future after realignment. And you've touched on it a little bit. Like the good G5s are going to be P5s or Pac-12 teams in the future, especially with UCLA leaving, USC leaving to go to the Big Ten. We're going to have some backfill there with G5 teams. And at that point, to me, they're no longer P5s. Josh, talk about this a little bit. With Utah was not a Power 5, and now they're one of the better P12 Pac-12 teams. Big 12 is not going to look like it looks today. At what point do we start looking at a situation like you said, where it's a P2 or a P3?
It's not that far off. And the big thing is that the money differential, which is already, we've talked for years about how there's a lack of investment in the Pac-12 in their programs and facilities and everything like that, and how it was creating really bad recruiting disparity, which is why they would show up in a non-conference game and get the doors blown off. That is going to accelerate because the television contracts are being renegotiated. And the contracts the Big Ten and the SEC are looking at are going to be $30 to $50 million a year per school larger. And remember, the operating budgets for a lot of these schools are about $100 million a year. It's a massive difference. And so that's just going to, I think it's just going to break any sort of sense of parity in it. And yeah, with USC and UCLA leaving, it's a little bit of a death by 1,000 cuts too. Like Texas, yeah, they lost today, and it's going to be easy for Big 12 fans to say it's not a huge loss to lose Oklahoma and Texas. But more often than not, one of the two, more often than not, has been the best team in the Big 12. More often than not, UCLA and USC, one of the two is at least one of the best teams in the Pac-12. And in fact, in the past couple decades, USC has generally been the best team in the Pac-12. So when you take all those out of the mix, and the trick is they're not just disappearing from the Pac-12, they're added to the Big Ten and the SEC. So now there are going to be years where your former best team is now the fourth best team in another conference that also has three teams better than them. They're going to have like a half dozen teams better than anyone in the Pac-12, at which point, to your point, like it's not even, they're close to that now, and it's just going to get worse. The lower tier, your whatever, Maryland is going to have more financial resources than Washington will with the new TV contracts. Do people process that? And that's going to make it incredibly difficult for those other conferences to compete, other than the fact that you exist in that region. So theoretically, you're going to draw recruits that want to stay home. But even then, now that USC and UCLA are in the Big Ten, everybody's going to go to those two schools so they can play Big Ten football. Everybody's going to go to Oklahoma and Texas A&M so they can play SEC football. They're not going to want to play in the Big 12 if you're a five-star prospect. And yeah, I think that reality could happen a lot faster than people are appreciating, especially in view of the transfer portal.
It's interesting to me because we're talking through all of this, and I imagine the non-Big Ten and SEC fans, the broader national media and audience would go crazy if this happened. But I honestly think, looking at this year, SEC 1 and 2, Big Ten 1 and 2 should probably be your 4 playoff teams. And I know Oklahoma State's still undefeated out there. But if we're being entirely honest, do we think Oklahoma State is winning the SEC West over Alabama, the SEC East over Georgia, or the Big Ten East over Michigan or Ohio State? I don't. And if I'm being super honest, I think that a team's going to get left out of those top 2 of the SEC or Big Ten, and it's kind of a travesty, which only amplifies the problems I have with expanding the playoffs. But Josh, talk about that proposal. Like, if you were picking today, would you probably pick the 2 best teams in the SEC and the 2 best teams in the Big Ten if you're picking the best 4 teams for a playoff?
I would if I was picking the best 4. Everybody in our chat even has sort of talked about there's basically 3 or 4 teams and a huge drop off from everyone else. And Clemson's the one team that we both feel like is not there, but has the best shot because they do have an ultra super sharp quarterback that could come in and solve a major quarterback problem. And they have the talent otherwise to sort of go around it. But outside them, I mean, the drop that I see from Georgia, Ohio State, and Alabama to everyone else is significant. And Michigan maybe is up there. Clemson's maybe up there. So you're talking 1 ACC team and 4 SEC Big Ten teams. And I will beat this drum over and over, and it won't matter. But people need to understand that the 12-team playoff structure that was proposed requires the top 4 to all be conference champions, which means in the realignment world, there will be 1 Big Ten team and 1 SEC team. Of Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, and Georgia, there can only be 1 selected. of USC, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, there can only be one selected, which will mean the third and fourth seeds are going to go to something really stupid like a 2 or 3 loss Washington and a 1 or 2 loss Oklahoma State. That would be a 15 or 20 point underdog to Big Ten number 2 or SEC number 2.
Yeah,
It's
dumb. Auto bids is dumb. Auto bids plus auto seeding with conference champions is super dumb because let me tell you, finishing second in the Big Ten East is a bigger accomplishment than winning the Pac-12 10 times out of 10. It's been that way for a decade now. And so like I'm super annoyed that we want to like okay, you want to do this like participation trophy thing and kid yourself that a team that lost to Florida, who's not going to win the East, a team that lost to Florida in Utah is probably going to win the Pac-12 this year. We're going to auto bid them at third seed when the loser of Alabama and Georgia has to sit behind them. And like you said, would be today, Georgia would be a 3 touchdown favorite, maybe about an 18-point favorite over Utah, and they'd cover. I just think, why are we being asked to pretend we don't know what we know? That's what I'm bothered by. That's the whole thing with me.
I have less of an issue. I still have issues with the 12-team playoff because I don't think it's actually going to work in practice. I have less of an issue with the idea that 6 conference champions must be included. I've pointed out last year, what was it? Fresno State in the realignment world. Fresno State is your 6th conference champion. When you consider Cincinnati's going to be a Big 12 team, it's effectively going to be a Fresno State. So you would have ended up, because the way this is structured, Georgia was not a champion, so they have to be number 5. Fresno State has to be included. So round 1 is Georgia versus Fresno State, and that's going to suck. But I have less of a problem with the fact that you have to include a G5 champion or you have to include 6 champions somewhere than I do the fact that you have to have the champions be ranked 1 through 4. If you could at least be honest with the fact that the Pac-12 champion is the 8th best team or something, that would be a lot better. And the reason for that is if you start working out seedings, when you take a team that you know is the 12th best team, your whole bracket is screwed to heck, because now your second best team is 5th, which means they're going to destroy a whole bunch of people, while this other team that you forced to be 4th is going to lose their round, and somebody gets a really easy bracket because they get to play a pretender that was a top 4 team, where Georgia is playing a bunch of weaker teams. It's just really, really messed up. It's insane. They're going to be a really weird
to think about. Like this whole proposal that came, and I know we're running late and we probably only got about 5 more minutes, but this whole proposal, it's insane to me because it pretends that realignment isn't happening, but we all know that it is. So like you said, so last year, Cincinnati did not belong on the same field as Alabama, who lost to Georgia. But Cincinnati in the new world would be in the Big 12. And like you said, a Fresno, who is probably 3 touchdowns worse than Cincinnati or more, is going to be a higher seed than the team that actually won the national championship last year. Georgia would have beaten Fresno by 50 points. If they needed to. Like we saw what they did in Michigan, and then they kind of, put the brakes on later, and Michigan scored a little bit at the end. But Georgia was probably 40-something points better than Michigan last year. They would have absolutely dragged Fresno. So why are we doing this thing where we're not having Fresno play the Pac-12, the 3-loss Pac-12 champ that makes it? That's insane to me. Also, Horatio, it's so funny. Horatio mixes it up early in the comments with like normal trash talk. But by the end of our show, it's like Horatio versus 20 Big Ten fans. And he like levels up the trash talk to a point that's absolutely insane. And I feel like he's probably drinking brown party liquor like me. And he gets to this late night hour and just loses his mind a little bit.
Yeah, I will say Yeah, I've been kind of following it. It's amusing. It's gotten nasty enough that I felt like I needed to intervene. But the reality I would end with the playoff is something people need to process, that there's two different groups and they're both more than happy for this to happen. You have the Pac-12 and the Big 12 and the ACC or AAC, and they're all happy for it to happen. And they're happy for it to happen because they're scared of being rendered completely irrelevant. They are worried that in this new world order of college football, that they are never going to be in the playoffs again. And so they want to make sure that they get some piece of the playoff pie. But the conferences that are the new super conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, like Sankey is all for the 12-team playoff. And that should worry you.
Right.
Because the commissioners that know what they're doing, which are the two major conferences, are going to laugh all the way to the bank because they know the reality of the situation. They know, yeah, you think that getting a playoff slot, which by the way is only worth a few $1 million. There's this idea that getting a playoff slot suddenly creates parity. You lose 50-10 in the first round of a 4-round playoff. Nobody's going to care that you made that playoff, especially when it was an auto bid. And the idea that it's going to bring a bunch of money is just completely mistaken. The TV contracts are worth about $50 million. That game's worth like 2 or 3. It's not worth a lot of money. Even the championship and the playoff, most of the major teams that go, like Alabama and Ohio State, they often borderline lose money playing in those games because it costs more to travel and take the team and do everything they need to do than they actually make off the game. But what the SEC knows is going to happen is the Big Ten and the SEC are going to have their teams in the playoff, and they're going to destroy those pretender teams from the AAC and the Big 12 and the Sun Belt and the Pac-12. And so by the second or third round of the playoff, it's going to be like 7 Big Ten and SEC teams and one other. And that's going to happen year after year after year until everybody else is just sort of this token also ran and they're completely forgotten, while the SEC and the Big Ten start raking in all the money, not really in the playoff, but in the regular season, because they're going to be the only thing anybody watches. And what I hate about it is if that reality comes to pass, it's going to really destroy the sport as we know it, which I personally think is a shame. Me being the chalk heavy, favorite heavy guy, because I am that sort of person, because I believe the favorites do normally win, because I do believe that this is a chalk heavy sport, this terrifies me because I don't think people understand how much this larger playoff structure is going to just benefit the rich. And I think people have a sort of delusion that if you change things, it'll make it more even. No, it can absolutely get worse. And if it gets worse, if you're an Oregon State fan, you may not be a fan in 10 years. And that's just going to be the reality of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing for me is like, I don't think people understand how much this makes the rich get richer. And that's what frustrates me for college football, because we get, and I say this all the time, we get killed for being like snobs or whatever, snobs for the big teams. But we're out here saying, don't do this. It helps the big teams. It helps 2015 Ohio State get in the playoffs. It helps 2019 Alabama get in the playoffs. The only way you keep Alabama from winning, or whatever the best SEC team is that you don't give them mulligans, right? And this just gives them mulligans. And I think, Josh, here's my thing, and tell me if you agree. I would be far more okay with this if I had any confidence that if they saw it was a disaster, they'd roll it back. My concern is they'll never roll it back. They'll just keep expanding the playoffs.
I agree with that. I don't know that it's going to expand beyond 12 because I think they're going to realize very quickly what it is. But yeah, it is the equivalent of trying to tell your buff, like protein powder crushing buddy, hey, don't play with that M80. That'll blow your finger off. And he's like, I play with firecrackers all the time. Don't tell me what to do. It just, there's a lot of people that don't want to believe that, yeah, okay, you've messed around in the world you messed around with, and I'm trying to warn you, don't play this game that you're trying to play right now. It's not going to go well for you. And everybody has their own ego. All these fans of these teams, these commissioners, these conferences in particular, Like Kliavkov, I mean, his job right now is to make money for the Pac-12 today. And these presidents, they're just trying to get to the next year or the next renewal of their contract 2 or 3 years down the line. And they see all this as just a way to preserve themselves right now. And I know somebody's mentioning Josh Pate, a CFP commissioner. Like, we talk back and forth, and I think we're very much aligned on this. Those guys are trying to survive today and tomorrow and the year after, and that's it.
Yep.
They don't care about the 5 to 10 year problems in the sport. They don't care about the 10-year impacts of this. And frankly, a lot of the presidents making these decisions, particularly in the Pac-12, where they're extremely academic focused in those positions, they barely understand or know anything about sports. It's not what they were hired to do. That's not the track they came out of. And they have somebody that's sort of an advisor that tells them what's going on, and they sure fine. That's why Scott was kept around for entirely too long, because he seemed like a nice guy, and they didn't have a darn clue how much he was screwing up. So there's way too many egos in play. It's way too short-sighted, people that don't have an understanding of the sport. And yes, sitting here today, I would virtually guarantee you, I understand the repercussions of this a lot better than most of the decision makers in the room in those conferences. Not Sankey, not the Big Ten guys who were hired because sports matters in those conferences, but the ones we're talking about right now, the ones that are gonna get thrown in the toilet. Those decisions are being made by people that just don't have an appreciation and or don't care about what it's going to do to them 5 to 10 years later. That's just the reality of it.
All right. I got to go to bed. So I want you to close on one thought after this Saturday. Who improved the most in your mind based on what you saw today versus where you had them coming into this day? Who impressed you the most in terms of improvement? And we'll end on that.
I'll give you 3 teams, but they're fairly obvious, but Ohio State and Alabama both took major steps forward to be the number 2, number 1, number 3 teams that I expected. They look like they belong with Georgia today for the first time really this year to me. Like they've taken that step up against something better competition than they've played. And then the other one I would say is Tennessee. I did not have a particularly high opinion of Tennessee going into the season or even to this week. Their offense is legitimately quite good, maybe a little bit special. And I do think their defense maybe is a step back, but they're in a bit of a different tier in my mind than they were last week. So that's probably my answer to that question.
Yeah, I think those are all good answers. We had Ohio State winning comfortably against Wisconsin, but what they did today was impressive. And I think that Alabama fans who maybe saw this game didn't realize that they were working on stuff that's not even in their wheelhouse, not even in their core offense. If you go look at the box score and see how many times they ran the ball. They were working on stuff. I have a lot of confidence that Alabama might actually kill Arkansas next week. And to your point, and it's very exciting. I think that this week is low key, super interesting and exciting for down the stretch, because a lot sort of got filled out in terms of what we understand about college football. And one of the things that got filled out is Ohio State and Alabama showing that they are on par with Georgia, or maybe getting there. Tennessee, for me, obviously, I had them jump in my top 10, but my concern with Tennessee is the defense, and that's been the thing since Heupel got there. I have this theory that you can't run an offense, that you can't practice and get solid an offense that runs that many plays and also have a good defense. We haven't seen one yet. We saw the same problem at Oklahoma when Lincoln Riley was there. I think that's what Tennessee is going to suffer from that as well. But that also means they can beat anybody on any given Saturday, including Alabama later in the year. All right, y'all, that's it for us. We are super tired, but we made it 2 hours and 13 minutes. Thank you so much for hanging on this late. And for the podcast listeners, thank you for checking us out as well. We will post a separate top 10 if you didn't hear that segment in here. We usually get that out on Sunday morning. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great